Welcome to Module 4, Advocacy in Action. Up to this point, we've been working on understanding an issue, defining it, researching it, and connecting it to a UN, UDHR, or SDG lens. Now we get to make a strategic choice. What are we actually going to do about it? Advocacy can take a lot of forms. We can educate people. We can change a public narrative. We can mobilize people, support a coalition, influence an agency, meet with legislators, lobby on legislation, or direct resources toward a need. None of those approaches is automatically stronger than another. The question throughout this module is, which move fits the change you're trying to make? By the end of this module, you'll have a broader sense of what advocacy can actually look like. First, you should be able to recognize several different moves because having more tools gives you more strategic choices. Second, you'll get to match the approach to the change you want. Third, you'll get to stretch strategically. Most of us have a default. Writers want to write something. Event people want to host an event. Social media people want to make a campaign. Those skills are valuable, but familiarity is not a strategy. I want you to consider an approach that might require learning something new or taking a calculated risk, while balancing that against what is realistic within your time frame. And finally, we'll cover the basic nonprofit guardrails so you know where we have room to advocate and where we need organizational review. Here is the basic decision process we'll use. Start with the desired change, not the deliverable. What should actually be different if this project works? Then diagnose the barrier or barriers. Why isn't that change already happening? Only then choose the primary approach. After that, bring reality back into the picture. What can you meaningfully contribute with the time, access, skills, relationships, and organizational capacity you actually have? And finally, ask what needs review. If it involves legislation, speaking publicly for UNAB Boulder, asking another organization to partner, fundraising, or anything that could create organizational commitments, bring leadership in before the project is already rolling. Strategy lives somewhere between imagination and reality. We want both. Here's a shortcut I want us to resist. We find an interesting issue and immediately say, let's write an article, or let's host an event, or we should make an infographic. Those may turn out to be excellent ideas. But notice what happened. We chose the product before we diagnosed the problem. Suppose the real barrier is that one congressional office needs to hear directly from constituents. A beautifully designed infographic might not do much. Suppose the barrier is that another organization is already running an effective campaign, but lacks local reach. Starting a competing UNA Boulder campaign could be less useful than amplifying theirs. So instead of beginning with, what should we make? Begin with, what is blocking the change and what might actually move it? That little shift is one of the biggest differences between producing advocacy content and thinking strategically. Here are 4 common diagnoses. Maybe people don't understand the issue. Then information or narrative could matter. Maybe the public understands and cares, but they don't know how to act. In that case, another explainer might not help. They may need a pathway into meaningful participation. Maybe the public understands and cares, but someone else has the authority to make the change. Now we need to know who can say yes and what they need: evidence, public pressure, constituent support, political cover, resources, or something else. Or maybe credible advocates are already leading. Then the strategic question may be, what can we contribute without duplicating, competing with, or speaking over work that already exists? You may eventually find that your project has several barriers. That's normal. For now, identify the one that appears most important. That gives you somewhere to start. Public education is probably the advocacy approach most people recognize first. We explain something so that people can understand it more accurately or completely. This is valuable when lack of understanding really is part of the barrier. Maybe the issue is technical. Maybe people know something is happening but don't understand why. Maybe the connection between a Colorado concern and a global issue isn't obvious. This is where explainers, workshops, guides, and public events can be incredibly useful. But here's the catch: aware is not automatically an outcome. We've raised awareness is often where advocacy plans go to die. Ask one more question. Not that people understand this, but what becomes possible? Maybe public understanding creates support for a policy. Maybe it prepares people to participate. Maybe it corrects misinformation that has been blocking a solution. Education is strongest when you can see what comes after education. This one may require a mindset shift. Advocacy culture sometimes rewards ownership. Our campaign, our event, our initiative. But if another organization has already spent years building trust, expertise, relationships, and momentum, creating our own version may not be leadership. It may just be duplication. Coalition support asks a different question. What would make the existing work stronger? Maybe UNA Boulder can provide research. Maybe we can translate an issue through a UN or human rights lens. Maybe we can reach a group the coalition has trouble reaching. Maybe we can bring volunteers, communications capacity, or even convening power. And sometimes the contribution is simply amplifying a well-designed action instead of inventing another one. The aha here is important. Contribution doesn't require ownership. Strategic advocacy is about advancing the outcome, not making sure our logo is at the center of it. Grassroots engagement is the move from, you should care about this, to, here is something meaningful you can do. It works when public participation can affect an outcome through public comments, constituent outreach, attendance, organizing, contacting a decision maker, or another concrete action. But participation needs somewhere to go. 50 people signing something sounds impressive. 50 people signing something that nobody with authority ever sees? Much less impressive. So build the pathway backward. Who needs to receive the action? What do we want them to notice? Why would participation influence them? What happens next? And be careful not to confuse activity with power. The goal isn't simply to get people busy, it's to connect their participation to a real leverage point. Sometimes we can overcomplicate advocacy. The barrier may actually be resources. Maybe a partner already knows what needs to happen. It has the program, community relationships, and plan, but lacks money, supplies, or capacity. In that situation, directing resources toward the work may be a very legitimate contribution. The strategic test is the question at the bottom of this slide. What becomes possible because we raised the money? If our answer is simply, we held a fundraiser, we're still describing the activity. If our answer is, this partner can now provide translation at 6 community meetings, or this initiative can now distribute materials to 500 additional households, now we can see the connection between the resource and the outcome. Fundraising should be attached to a defined need rather than becoming a generic project because fundraising feels concrete. This may be one of the less familiar options and one of the more interesting. We tend to think of policy change as passing laws, but a tremendous amount happens after a law exists. Agencies write rules, they establish procedures, they make implementation decisions, they administer programs. Budgets and guidance affect what happens on the ground. So if the problem isn't the underlying law, ask the legislature to pass another law may be the wrong move entirely. Administrative advocacy might mean submitting public comments during rulemaking, providing an agency with evidence about implementation problems, meeting with officials, or analyzing how a policy is functioning in practice. The aha is not every policy problem needs a new law. Sometimes the real leverage point is buried several layers below the headline. Legislative education is about helping policymakers understand an issue when you're not asking them to support or oppose specific legislation. This is relationship and knowledge building. Congressional staff may cover enormous portfolios. A concise briefing that combines credible evidence, district or state relevance, community experience, and a clear UN connection can be genuinely valuable. And meetings do not always need to end with, vote yes on this. Sometimes the strategic outcome is that a staff member knows who UNA Boulder is, understands why an issue matters locally, and sees us as a credible source they can return to. That is why the aha here is a meeting is useful only if it changes what someone understands. Access is not the outcome. What happens because of the access is what matters. And sometimes education is not enough. There is an actual legislative decision in front of us, and the strategic move is to ask for something. That is lobbying. Maybe we ask a member of Congress to support or oppose specific legislation. Maybe we ask constituents to contact Congress regarding a specific appropriation decision. Here's the important aha. Lobbying and partisan politics are not the same thing. A 501c3 public charity is allowed to engage in some lobbying. There are limits, and the organization needs to manage those limits. But lobbying itself is not prohibited. What is prohibited is intervening in an election on behalf of or against a candidate. So please support this legislation and please support this candidate live in very different legal categories. For us, the practical rule is simpler than the tax code. If your project moves toward a specific legislative ask, stop and bring UNA Boulder leadership into the process before you publish, mobilize, or represent the organization. Narrative advocacy is related to public education, but it's doing something different. Education often asks, what don't people know? Narrative advocacy asks, what story are people already using to understand this? And is that story helping or hurting? Every issue arrives with assumptions. Who caused the problem? Who deserves attention? Is this an individual problem or a structural one? Is this change realistic? Whose voice counts as credible? An op-ed, story project, media pitch, or spokesperson can challenge those assumptions. The goal isn't just to tell a moving story. The strategic question is the one on the slide. What needs to be understood differently for change to become more possible? That keeps storytelling attached to the advocacy goal rather than treating attention as the endpoint. Now we can step back and start combining the menu. These categories aren't sealed boxes. If public understanding is part of the barrier, public education or narrative advocacy might be primary. But maybe people understand the issue and simply need a pathway into action. Then grassroots engagement becomes more important. Or maybe a trusted coalition already has the message and the action. What they need is help getting it in front of more people. So think of these approaches as different ways of applying pressure to a barrier, not as project types you have to select from a drop-down menu. Your project may ultimately use more than one. The important thing is knowing which one is doing the strategic heavy lifting. The same is true on the institutional side. If an agency controls implementation, administrative advocacy may be the move. If policymakers don't yet understand the problem, legislative education may come first. If specific legislation is already moving, lobbying may be appropriate. And if an organization has the authority and strategy but lacks resources, fundraising might unlock its ability to act. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is trying to solve an institutional power problem entirely with public awareness. Sometimes awareness helps create pressure. But eventually we have to ask, who has the authority, resources, or power to make this decision? And what could influence them? We'll go much deeper into that question when we map decision makers and power later in the workshop. Let's put this together with our example on strengthening U.S. support for the United Nations. Same issue for completely different strategies. Public education. We might create a Colorado-focused explainer about why US-UN cooperation is crucial. Coalition support. We might find that UNA USA or the Better World campaign already has a strong action underway. Instead of reinventing it, we add Colorado context and help amplify it. Legislative education. We might prepare a short, district-relevant briefing for congressional staff about US-UN cooperation without asking them to act on specific legislation. Legislative lobbying. If there is a specific funding or appropriations decision, we might ask constituents to urge Congress to support that particular legislative action. Same broad cause, very different moves. Which one is best? We can't answer that until we know the barrier. That's the entire point of this module. Now for the guardrails. And I want to frame these as review points, not reasons to be afraid of advocacy. Being a 501c3 doesn't require UNA Boulder to be silent on public issues. The IRS explicitly allows charitable organizations to take positions on public policy issues, including issues on which candidates disagree, as long as the communication doesn't favor or oppose a candidate. So our questions aren't, is this political? Almost every meaningful public issue can become political. The better questions are, what are we doing? Whose name are we doing it in? And does it trigger a legal or organizational boundary? Resource asks should be reviewed. Coalition commitments and co-branding should be reviewed. Anything being spoken, published, posted, or distributed in UNA Boulder's name needs appropriate organizational oversight. Legislative asks need review because lobbying has legal limits and the needs to be tracked appropriately. Elections are the bright red line. A 501c3 organization can't support or oppose a candidate or political party. That includes more than formal endorsements. The IRS looks at the facts and circumstances surrounding organizational communications and activities. One nuance on this slide. Voter guides and candidate events are not automatically prohibited, but they have strict nonpartisan requirements and can create risk if structured in a way that favors or opposes candidates. For our projects, that means they absolutely belong in the review before rolling out category, rather than something you independently design and publish. The practical takeaway is simple. Don't shrink the idea because you're unsure. Bring the idea forward and ask for review. Before we finish, bring this back to your own project. First, which approach most directly addresses the barrier to change? Not which one sounds fun. Not which one you already know how to do. Which one actually fits the barrier? Then push yourself one step further. Is there another approach you initially dismissed because it feels unfamiliar? You don't need to choose the riskiest or the most complicated strategy, but it's important to distinguish between that isn't feasible and I've never done that before. Your project is a pretty good place to try a move you haven't made before with our support. And that brings us to the second question. What do you need from UNA Boulder leadership to move forward? Permission, an introduction, review of a public statement, help contacting a partner, clarification about lobbying, access to an existing relationship. Identifying that support now makes it much easier to move from an interesting idea to an executable strategy. That's it for this module. The big idea is to carry forward is simple. Don't choose the deliverable first. Diagnose the barrier, then choose the move. Get creative. Take a calculated risk when it makes sense. Stay realistic about capacity. And when you get close to an organizational or legal boundary, bring leadership into the conversation rather than backing away from advocacy altogether. Next, we'll take these possible approaches and get more deliberate about selecting the strategic direction for your project.